Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIMH, Part 2. So, apologies. The camera I'm using has a 30-minute time limit. If I ramble on for too long, the camera automatically turns off and then I have to film a separate video. I realize that this is a children's book, and at this point going into a second video after I've already rambled for more than 30 minutes is probably getting a little bit ridiculous, long-winded, self-indulgent. I guess I'm being self-indulgent at this point. I fully realize that for a children's book, I probably should have wrapped this up after one video. There are more things I wanted to say, so I thought I would be self-indulgent and film another video. That doesn't necessarily mean anyone is obligated to watch this. I fully realize there's probably a time limit for how much interest a children's book has in a review format like this, and I'm probably over that limit anyways. But I'm gonna make this video, and if people don't want to watch it, that's fine. I feel like there's some more stuff to say about this. So I think when the video shut off previously, I was talking about some of the sequels to this book. There are two sequels to The Rats of NIMH. One of them I actually read way back in the day when I was in 5th grade, Rascal and the Rats of NIMH. I enjoyed reading the original Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIMH so much that I continued on to the next book, which was also in the school library at the time. I don't remember anything about it now. I remember little bits and pieces of it, but I remember very little. But I remember really enjoying it. I was on Wikipedia before filming this review and found out something that I'm not sure I realized back when I was in 5th grade, which was that Rascal and the Rats of NIMH was not actually, it's not by the original author of Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIMH. It's by his daughter. The original author had passed away by that time, so his daughter wrote the sequel. But in the sequel, and again this is according to Wikipedia, we find out that actually Jenner is still alive. He was not actually electrocuted in the mechanics store like it was implied in the book. We find out that Justin is still alive. There was another rat that had died. So the two things that are left ambiguous at the end of Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIMH are actually cleared up in the sequel. But it's an interesting question whether or not you want to retrofit that onto the Rats of NIMH, because the sequel is not by the original author. It's by his daughter. So the original vision of the author was to leave it ambiguous, whether or not Jenner was alive or whether or not Justin had died. And I find that interesting that he chose to leave it ambiguous, and somewhat frustrating as well. This is another place where maybe the book feels like it could have been used a bit of a punch. But the author obviously preferred to leave things ambiguous. I want to back up now and talk about the beginning of this book as a reading experience. And again, like I mentioned in the previous video, I was using this book with Vietnamese students who are at a high level of English, but who had never encountered this book before. And it was interesting to see how they digested it. In the book and in the movie as well, but it's very noticeable in the book. The beginning chapters are all about Mrs. Frisby, and she's worrying about Timothy. Timothy is sick. Again, if you're familiar with the story, you know the beats. He's sick. They've got to move him before the plowing day comes and the tractor comes through the field, but he's got pneumonia, and what's she going to do? And it's not really until, I believe it's chapter 12, that Mrs. Frisby is actually inside the rat's house, and she's finally realizing what an extraordinary thing these Rats of NIMH have got going on. So the big plot twist where we find out that these Rats of NIMH are actually something very special doesn't actually happen until 12 chapters in. And in a way, I think this is quite clever. The way it's very slowly teased throughout. I mean, the first indication that you get of it is Mr. Ages, who's acts as kind of like a pharmacist for the small animals around the Fitzgibbons farms, and he's out collecting leaves and making powders, and knows all the medicinal qualities. And there's maybe a question that goes off in the reader's mind, or maybe not, about how did this mouse learn all about the medicinal properties of all these leaves? And then a little bit later, we find out that Dragon the cat is acting a little bit strange. In the middle of the day, he's acting like sleepy, but not really sleepy, like very lethargic, and we don't know what's going on with that. Then we see the rats going across the lawn carrying a wire, electrical wire, and it's not clear why they've got an electrical wire. I believe that was in chapter 5, maybe. And then later the owl says something about going to the rats. So, oh, and sorry, I almost forgot the mystery of Jonathan Frisby, who I think we find out right from chapter 1 has died recently, but we really don't know anything about him, and it's not said how he died and left open as a bit of a mystery. So I thought, and I knew what was coming because I was familiar with the story, but reading this with my students, I'm like, okay, guys, did you notice that? That's a little bit strange, isn't it? Or what about this? And trying to draw their attention to some of the various hints that the author is leaving before you get to the plot twist on chapter 12. Now, my students who are teenagers, teenagers for the most part. Like I said, I did this with a few different classes, but about 16, 17, 18, or 19 was the age range. Were beginning to lose patience with the story, because the story was all about Timothy Frisby, the sick little mouse who has pneumonia, and whether or not they're going to be able to move him before the tractor comes through. Which, okay, I mean, I don't want to say it's completely without conflict, because they do set up a conflict very cleanly here. Timothy needs to move, he's too sick to move, the plow is coming. So it's a classic conflict set up, but it's a little bit boring as it is there, just waiting for will they or won't they be able to move him before the plow comes through. So that was there was one class where I almost had to stop doing the story because I think they were getting so bored with it. And then chapter 12 kicks off, and then they find out, oh, okay, so these rats have this whole big civilization under the ground, and they've got electricity and elevators in the library, and then that starts to get really interesting. And then chapter 14, we get into the backstory, and initially they were really interested in that, but then the backstory just goes on for way too long, like I said in the previous video, and then I started to lose their interests again. So in terms of student interest, it started off a bit slow, and then they got more and more impatient with it. And then chapter 12, when they're discovering the rat home where Mrs. Frisby is getting shown all the wonderful things the rats have underground, interest went up. The beginning of the backstory, interest went up. As the backstory just kept going on and on and on, interest seemed to go down a bit. Another interesting thing is, unless I missed something, or maybe the online version I was using was incomplete in some way, NIM, the acronym NIM, is never actually identified in the book. And I have this memory of reading this book in 5th grade and being like, that's what NIM means. But maybe that was a manufactured memory. You know, there's all these research about how people remember things that didn't happen. I could have sworn I remembered reading the book and finding out what NIM actually means. Maybe the teacher pointed it out to us and I'm misremembering. But certainly in the online version I was using, the one I'll link to down below, they say the word NIM several times, but nowhere does it actually say the National Institute for Mental Health. Now, in the movie, it actually does get a brief mention. It gets kind of like a blink it and you miss it mention. But it does actually, I think it's Farmer Fitzgibbon talking to his wife, and he says something like, yeah, you know, NIMH, National Institute for Mental Health, they want to come in the morning. So it's thrown there in the movie, but it's, yeah, it was nowhere in the version of the book I was using. And I thought that was interesting, that it never got spelled out for the reader what exactly that meant. Maybe a lot of kids have a teacher like I did who explained the meaning to them. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention this before, but when I was using this in my classroom, I was researching online for supplementary materials to use, and there is a lot of material out there, meaning it appears that in America, a lot of school teachers have been using this book in the classroom, are still using this book in the classroom. And that's how I was introduced to it myself 30 years ago when my teacher was using it in the classroom. So it appears to be still a classic to use in school classrooms in America, at least. But jumping back to what I was saying earlier about how for the first 12 chapters, there are some little mysteries that are teased, but we really, until that plot twist kicks in chapter 12, we really have no idea that the story is going to be all about the rats and that the rats are so unusual. When I was doing this with my students, I had that version I found online, and I was copying and pasting onto a Google document and printing it out and handing it out to them every class. Or when I did it as a listening one, I would send them the links to the listening every class. And they were not constantly seeing Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIMH. They were just seeing the chapter titles. So, you know, like Chapter 5, Mr. Fitzgibbon's Plow, or something like that. And that helped to kind of hide the fact that once we get to Chapter 12, we're going to find out that the story is all about the rats. Because, again, it's a good 12... Well, she goes to the owl, I think, around Chapter 10 or something like that. So the owl is saying, okay, these rats are pretty amazing. But yeah, the first easily third of the book, the whole first third, you wouldn't know that the story is going to be all about the rats. Unless, of course, you were looking at the title. Because the title right there says Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIMH. Now again, like I said, in my own classes, I was able to keep the title hidden from them. But you can't do that, obviously, if you buy this book back in America or pick it up off the library or whatever. I almost wonder if that title was something that the publishers chose rather than the author. I can't find any information on this online one way or the other. But it seems like something that the publishers would want because it gives the story a mysterious title. But I wonder if the author would have preferred to keep that hidden from the reader, that this story is actually all about the rats. Because it seems like the first 10 chapters, he's teasing it a little bit, but we're still focused on Mrs. Frisby and Timothy Frisby, and that's where the focus is. So I thought that was an interesting plot twist, or an interesting way that the main plot of the book was kept hidden for about the first 10 chapters. Last thing I want to talk about maybe is the parts that really don't work as well if you want to examine this book logically. And it's a children's book, so how much scrutiny you want to put into it or how much logic you want to apply to it may be an open question. But I'm going to talk about this anyways. The big problem with this book from a logical point of view is it's a talking animal story where all the animals are already intelligent, which makes it a little bit questionable about what is qualitatively different about the rats. So we start off and Mrs. Frisby's getting breakfast for her children, and she comes back to her house and talks about the hallway, and Timothy was still sick in bed with the sheets wrapped around them. And already we have this family of mice that can talk, that's intelligent, that knows about plowing day, that's living in a house, and it's described as being a cinder block house, but it's got apparently rooms and bedrooms and sleeping in a bed with bed sheets on it. And I was thinking, I've been thinking about this, and I thought, okay, maybe because it's Jonathan Frisby's family, it's more advanced than the other animals. We don't really get a good idea of what the other mice live like. But it's not really clear in the book that Mrs. Frisby and her family are living in a different way than the other field mice or the other animals are living. And certainly for the reader, who doesn't know that there's these super intelligent rats coming later in the story and who's just starting out at chapter 1, the impression you get is that this is a world where all the animals talk and where everyone's intelligent. That's why, to a certain extent, it didn't quite work with my students when I was trying to get them to wonder about how Mr. Ages knows so much about medicine. It's like, okay, do you guys think that's a little bit mysterious that this mouse is running this little pharmacy here? How did he know all about medicine? And the students were just like, well, no, he must have studied it. Or, you know, it wasn't surprising to them, because in this book, it's not really clear what the ordinary mice know and what they don't know. But the assumption is, if they're talking like humans, and they seem to have ordinary human intelligence, I think the assumption a lot of readers would make is that in this world, the mice are just as intelligent as humans, and they appear to be just as intelligent as humans. Now, the difference with the rats is that the rats have a much more elaborate home that they've constructed underground, and they know how to work electricity, and they know how to read. And this becomes clear a little bit later in the book, but it's certainly not clear from the beginning that there's anything to stop an ordinary animal from learning about electricity. They seem to be able to learn about everything else. Even later, I mean, Mrs. Frisby says she can read a little bit because her husband taught her to. Now, she can't read fluently, but I mean, if she can read a little bit, she can read. I mean, such a big deal is made about how the fact that the rats were able to read after getting training in this laboratory experiment, and in a combination with these injections, which, according to the book, altered their DNA in some way. But Mrs. Frisby, who never had the injections to alter her DNA, can still read a little bit. And I guess the author is attempting to make a distinction between the fact that Mrs. Frisby can only read a little bit and the rats can read fluently. But felt to me like that wasn't a very meaningful distinction. I mean, if she can read a little bit, she can still read. She doesn't need all the injections to teach her how to read, apparently. So that's the big problem with this book in terms of logical consistency, is that all the animals are already intelligent. So it's sometimes not really clear why it's different that the rats are intelligent. The other thing is, it's a little bit confusing figuring out what's going on with this whole language thing. I mean, Mrs. Frisby and Jeremy the Crow are talking to each other. And if you wanted to be super analytical here, you could say, okay, well, look at this dialogue that the crow is saying. There's no way a crow could possibly articulate that, even if you grant that they're intelligent enough to understand subordinate clauses and grammar. That, you know, with their beaks, they just don't have the articulatory apparatus. You know, they don't have a teeth, their tongue. I don't know what a crow's tongue looks like, but they couldn't articulate the sounds of English. Now, obviously, you would never want to overanalyze this book to that degree. You just kind of accept that a talking animal book, they can all talk somehow. And maybe you say, well, who's to say they're speaking in English? Maybe they're speaking in an animal language, and the author has just translated it into English. But then it's not, because all the animals understand what the humans are saying around them. So they can all understand English. And this appears to be the case even with the animals that didn't grow up with the humans. For example, Mrs. Frisby and her family are field mice. They didn't grow up as pets inside the house. But Mrs. Frisby can overhear the conversations of the Fitzgibbons family. She knows what they're saying. So they're multilingual. They have their own animal language and they understand the human language, and it's not clear how they got enough exposure to understand the human language, or all the animals are talking in English. I'm not sure. The animals never really make an attempt to talk to the humans, so it's not clear if the communication would go in both directions from this book. The cat also appears to be outside of the animal community. They described like the cat screaming at times, or having like a cry of rage, but nobody ever talks with the cat. Certainly in the movie, the cat is portrayed as just this dumb animal who's only in attack mode, and the book is actually not very far off from that either. That's the impression that you get. So all the animals can talk to each other, the crow and the rats and the mice and the owl, but then the cat is somehow different. They can understand the humans. There's comments made at one point about squirrels talking. At the same time, I get the impression that fish are outside of this animal community, because at one point Nicodemus talks about taking fishing nets up with them to Thorn Valley. So presumably they're going to catch and eat the fish, which I guess they wouldn't do if the fish were also intelligent. It's just, I guess what I'm saying is the rules of this world or this universe are not very clear. Now, like I said earlier in the previous video, it still feels real because the author has put in enough time and details into kind of creating this sense of a world that you can live in and where you can visualize everything. So it feels real, but it doesn't make sense if you think too much about it. And I could go on and on about this. You know, when the rats are first captured, or when Nicodemus is telling the story about how the rats are first captured, he tells Mrs. Frisby about how one of them was the lead neurobiologist scientist, and the two other were his graduate students. And I'm thinking, well, how does a rat know what a graduate student is? Okay, maybe Nicodemus learned this later because all the rats became super intelligent. But he's telling this story to Mrs. Frisby, and Mrs. Frisby has spent her entire life out on the farm. How does Mrs. Frisby know what a graduate student is or what a scientist is? Or it just, yeah, that's the biggest logical problem with this book. And I think even when I was a kid, this may have nagged at me a little bit when I was in 5th grade, but I was able to largely ignore it. As an adult, I have a harder time ignoring it. This just strikes me as a problem with this book, that as much as I try not to think about it too much, I just can't help myself from thinking about it too much. So, yeah, those are the big cons with the book, as well as the positives. And as I mentioned before, some of the same things are both positives and negatives, depending on which way you look at it. I think I have more to talk about if I were to think hard enough about it. But for the moment, I'm not thinking of anything else. And since this is the second video, I certainly have rambled on long enough anyways. I think I'm just going to finish here.